What if I told you that one of the biggest political controversies in American history came down to a few hundred votes right here in Florida? Yeah, you heard me. Just a few hundred votes out of millions. Kind of wild, right? Hey there, folks. Welcome back to Old Florida Now. I'm your host, Bo Carter. And what with today being election day and all, I thought, what a perfect opportunity to look back at some Florida history that's, well, pretty relevant to what's going on today. So today we're talking about the 2000 presidential election. It's one of those pivotal moments in history where Florida wasn't just along for the ride. No, sir, we were at the wheel. But before we get too far into it, let me set the scene. Grab yourself some sweet tea and let's unravel this whole mess together.
Welcome to Old Florida Now, where we uncover the rich history and hidden stories of the Sunshine State. Each episode will explore the people, places, and events that shaped Florida's past. Let's dive in.
All right. So November 7th, 2000, election night, you've got George W. Bush on the Republican side and Al Gore, the Democrat. Now, both these guys were neck and neck in the polls. The whole country was watching. But as it turned out, everyone's eyes ended up glued to Florida. And if you remember this, or maybe you don't, it all starts getting crazy right around 7 p.m. Eastern. The networks, they start calling Florida for Gore. Then they're like, hold up, never mind. And they retract that call. A couple hours later, they're like, no, we were wrong again. It's Bush. And then they're like, oops, too close to call. It was absolute chaos. You had people flipping channels, trying to figure out what in the world was going on. Yeah, I mean, just imagine it. You're sitting there watching TV and they keep changing their minds. By midnight, no one knew who the next president was going to be. And it turned out the whole thing was hanging on our good old state of Florida. Now let's get into the nitty gritty. Florida had 25 electoral votes up for grabs. Both candidates were within spitting distance of the 270 they needed to win. Bush was up at 246, Gore at 250. Whoever won Florida would be moving into the White House. But here's the thing. When all the ballots got counted that first time, Bush was ahead by about 1,784 votes out of almost 6 million cast. That's a difference of like not even a high school football crowd. Because that margin was so thin, Florida law automatically triggered a machine recount. And after that, Bush's lead shrank even further to just 327 votes. Yeah, you heard me right. 327 votes. Suddenly, Florida wasn't just a battleground. It was the battlefield. So Gore's campaign, they weren't too happy with that result. They're thinking maybe there's more votes out there that didn't get counted right. So they requested manual recounts in a few key counties: Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, and Volusia. Now, these places lean Democrat, so it made sense for Gore to focus there. But what came next? That's where things got real messy. Let's talk about those punch card ballots. You'd think something like punching a card would be simple, right? Turns out, not so much. See, they had these things called hanging chads. A chad is the little piece of paper that's supposed to get punched out. But sometimes folks didn't push hard enough, and the chad didn't fully detach. You had these hanging chads, dimpled chads, and even pregnant chads where the paper was just bulging but still attached. And now the question was, did those votes count or not? And you've got these canvassing boards looking at these punch cards, trying to decide what the voter meant. They're like, is that an indented chad enough to count as a vote? It was like interpreting tea leaves. One board might say, yeah, sure, this counts, while another might say, nah, this one doesn't. And this was all happening while the world watched. Reporters camped out outside courthouses, cameras rolling, and folks in Florida going about their business, knowing that our state was at the center of this storm. And then over in Palm Beach County, you've got the infamous butterfly ballot. This ballot design was supposed to make things easier by putting candidate names on both sides of a central punch column. But a lot of folks, they ended up voting for Pat Buchanan instead of Al Gore because of the layout. Now, Buchanan, he was a third-party candidate, and he got an unusual number of votes in Palm Beach, a place where he probably shouldn't have been that popular. So Gore's people are thinking, hold up, those were our votes. And it wasn't just Palm Beach, you know. Miami-Dade County had its own mess. The canvassing board there, they started a hand recount, but they stopped it halfway through. Yeah, I know, stopping a recount halfway through sounds kind of weird, right? But the pressure from legal challenges and the ticking clock got to them. Now, while all this was going on, you had lawyers swarming all over the state. The Florida Supreme Court got involved and ordered the recounts to continue. But the Bush campaign, they took it up to the U.S. Supreme Court saying the recounts weren't being done in a fair, consistent way. And the Supreme Court, they agreed. They stopped the recounts on December 12th, saying that, yeah, the different standards in each county violated the Equal Protection Clause. And, it's funny. Well, maybe not funny, but ironic in a way. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision came down on the exact date that Florida had to certify its electors, December 12th. That timing meant that there wasn't any time left for more recounts. Even if they wanted to, it was game over. That's how George W. Bush became the 43rd president by just 537 votes. Out of millions, Florida's 25 electoral votes went to Bush, and he ended up with 271 electoral votes to Gore's 266. Yeah. It's one of those what if moments. What if a few more folks had punched their ballots a little harder, or if the butterfly ballot wasn't so confusing? The whole course of history could have been different. Now, this election, it wasn't just about who won or lost. It changed a lot about how elections are run, not just here in Florida, but across the whole country. You had the passage of the Help America Vote Act in 2002. That law poured a bunch of money into states to replace those punch card systems with newer technology, like optical scan machines. They wanted to make sure no more hanging chads caused another national headache. And these new machines, well, they brought their own set of issues later on, but that's a story for another day. People started paying a lot more attention to things like voter registration databases, provisional ballots, and even making sure the machines themselves were working right. It was like this whole new era of trying to make sure every vote got counted right, which after Florida 2000, well, folks weren't just going to take that for granted anymore. And it brought up a lot of conversations about voter disenfranchisement too, how some communities, particularly Black and Latino voters, seem to run into more issues with their ballots, whether it was long lines, poorly maintained machines, or those pesky ballots. A lot of folks felt like the system didn't treat everyone equally. And that conversation is still with us today, isn't it? And people were starting to talk a lot more about election integrity, voter suppression, and how to make sure every vote counts. We've seen those issues pop up in a bunch of elections since. But this one, it was like the granddaddy of them, all when it comes to recount drama. So next time you're driving down to the Keys or heading over to the Panhandle, just think about it. There was a time when the fate of the free world came down to a couple hundred votes here. Like, imagine how different things might have been if a few more folks had hit the beach instead of the polls that day. Ain't that something? As I think about this whole Florida 2000 mess, it takes me back to being 16 years old. I wasn't exactly the most political kid. Back then, I cared more about cruising the back roads with my buddies and trying to scrape up enough cash for gas and a movie ticket. But I do remember how the whole state seemed to change overnight. Like, suddenly Florida was all anyone could talk about. Even folks like my dad, who usually didn't say much about politics, he'd be sitting at the kitchen table, coffee cup in hand, listening to the radio like he was trying to catch every word. It was a strange thing being a teenager and watching grown-ups talk about stuff like chads and recounts. And I remember my high school government teacher trying to explain it to us, why a couple hundred votes could decide the whole election and how the fate of the country was hanging on Florida. We didn't quite get it, but you could feel that it was important, that this wasn't just some chapter in a history book. It was happening right in our backyard. And I remember my folks, mom and dad, they'd sit up late flipping channels between the news stations trying to make sense of why they kept talking about Miami-Dade or Palm Beach like they were these battlegrounds. It was like the whole country had its eyes on places I'd only ever thought about as spots to go fishing or visit my cousins. It kind of made you look at Florida in a new light, like here we are, a state that's always kind of done its own thing, suddenly sitting at the center of it all. And being 16, I think what struck me most was how serious it all felt. You had these protests down in Miami, people shouting outside the courthouses. I remember seeing it on TV, and it felt like something out of a movie, not the Florida I knew where folks kept to themselves. there was this sense that even though I didn't really understand everything going on, we were all part of something bigger. And maybe that's what planted the seed for me years later, wanting to dig into Florida's history and share these stories. It's funny how those moments stick with you, even when you don't really get what they mean at the time. Like back then, I couldn't have told you the first thing about electoral votes or the Supreme Court, but I knew that my dad's voice had that serious edge to it, like he was worried about something. It's the kind of memory that makes you realize how connected we all are, even in a place like this, where it's easy to think we're just doing our own thing out in the sticks. And yeah, I got to admit, 16-year-old me, I wasn't thinking about democracy or recounts all that much, but looking back, I can see how that time shaped how I think about the world, made me realize that whether we like it or not, sometimes the big stuff can come knocking on our door. So yeah, this whole Florida 2000 story, it's a little more personal than just a headline. It's part of that strange time when I started seeing the world as a little bigger than my small town, but still tangled up with it. I don't know, maybe I'm rambling, but I guess that's what this podcast is all about, right? Looking back on where we've been, trying to make sense of it all, and maybe learning a thing or two along the way. Now, if all this talk about chads, recounts, and court battles has got your head spinning like a hurricane, don't worry. I've got a few places you can go to dig deeper. It's one of those stories that the more you look, the more layers you find. And trust me, there's a whole lot more under the surface of this one. So if you're curious about how the U.S. Supreme Court got involved and made that pivotal decision in Bush v. Gore, you might want to check out some info over at history.com. They've got a solid breakdown of the case and how it played out. It's not exactly light reading, but it does a good job of explaining why the court decided to stop the recounts and how that effectively handed Florida and the presidency to George W. Bush. And if you're more of a let's get into the data kind of person, there's a study from a group of news organizations that went through the Florida ballots again in 2001. This study looked at what might have happened if there had been a full recount of all the ballots statewide. The results showed that, well, things could have gone either way, depending on how the recount was done. You can read more about that from sources like factcheck.org and CNN's coverage back then. It's a good reminder of just how close and how messy this whole thing really was. For those of you who like a deep dive into the legal side, there's the Oyez Project, which gives a lot of detail on the Supreme Court's arguments in Bush v. Gore. It's got audio recordings and transcripts if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of what the justices were thinking. And let's be real, it's probably one of the most talked about cases in recent American history. Finally, if you're looking for a more down-to-earth take, check out articles from places like the Palm Beach Post or the St. Petersburg Times. They were right in the thick of it, covering how local Florida communities handled the chaos. And they've got archives that dig into everything from the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach to the overseas ballots that played a part in Bush's final margin. So yeah, there's no shortage of places to learn more. And if you're still curious or got a different take on what went down, well, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out, drop me a line, and let's keep the conversation going. All right, y'all. That's about it for today's episode of Old Florida Now. Hope you enjoyed this little trip down memory lane, or maybe learned something new if you're not as old as me. If you've got any questions, thoughts, or just want to yell at me about hanging chads, go ahead and drop a comment or send me a message. And hey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. I'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Old Florida Now. Stay tuned for more stories from the Sunshine State's past. Until next time.